Mr. Snyder here with the first video editing tutorial. What you're looking at right now is just a blank workspace for Shotcut Video Editor, which is a free download that can be used. It's a pretty decent, sort of a prosumer video editing software program. I'm just going to use it right now to teach you some of the technical information you need to understand and you need to know when you're working with video. The first thing is, let me open up a recent project here. I'm going to open up an edit I did of a coffee scene. Okay? And just really, I'm not going to talk about editing right now. I'm going to talk about technical things. But first, let me get rid of this track. I don't need it. It's in my way. So I'm going to remove video track 3. Now I've got two video tracks, video 1 and video 2. I've created a video on what is called the timeline. Timeline meaning that we start at 0 when we build our project. You can see on the counter there. And then we build out our project left to right, just like we read a book. So what's the information you need to know? Well, number one, let me pick a clip. Okay, let me open its properties up here. Click, and then these are the properties of this clip, the technical properties, and there's things you do need to know and understand. Okay, you can ignore the speed is like 1 time speed. We're never going to edit using 2, 3, 4 times speed if we're doing a scene that we want it to look real. Okay, that's just sort of a way to gimmick things up. So we're going to keep the speed at 1. Duration, what does that mean? It means that this clip is lasting just over 8 seconds. And I'll get into that. It's called time code. The other thing you need to know is, oh, look, it says codec. I had to convert these clips to work smoothly in Shotcut. So I converted them. It's called transcoding when you convert from one format to another. And so that's the codec I used to transcode. And H.264 is a very common codec used. There's all kinds of flavors of video. Here's the stuff we really need to focus on right now. Is the resolution of a video frame is 1920 by 1080 pixels. The same thing we've been doing if you've been doing graphics or anything like that. We've made things to fit this screen. And it's 1920 pixels horizontally by 1080 pixels vertically. Okay? Now, that means that this is a pixel image, means it's a raster image, means it's made of pixels, and we can't really scale it. Maybe a little bit in an emergency situation, but really, when you're dealing with pixel images, and video is a pixel raster image, scaling is really kind of a no-no, especially with video, because there's motion, you'll see some quality loss. Okay, so 1920 by 1080 pixels is the resolution of our clips. Frame rate, what is that? Well, it says 29.97. That's an odd number. That's just a technical thing. Really, we're going to call it 30 frames per second. It's almost 30 frames. Okay? But that's a holdover from the older days of video and television. 29.97. I won't get into the details of that. But we're going to call this a frame rate close to 30. And we'll just say 30. What's a frame? Well, a frame is, you've got to keep in mind that, let me drag this clip up again. Okay, there's its properties. If I take my play bar over this video clip and I play it, oh, I've got to turn off my shy. I've got to show the track. So that's called shy, when you've got the little eye is closed. Open it up. Let me play it again. As I'm playing it, what you're seeing is a sequence of individual photos or images that are playing in a sequence to create the illusion of motion. Okay, so really what you're seeing here on the program monitor is 1 frame of video, a single picture. I'm going to use my right arrow key and I'm going to advance by 1 frame, and you saw the motion. Okay, so if I play back a series of still images that are recorded in a sequence, and I play them back in that sequence, it'll give the illusion of motion. Watch. One more. Forward, forward, forward. If I go back, 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 back. So you're seeing individual frames. Now, the key is we're working with a standard of frame rate 29.97. Let's call it 30 for argument's sake. We're working with 30 frames per second. Okay, there are 30 individual frames for every second of video. Okay, that's an important number. Why? Because when you get into adding things like transitions, you'll need to know how long things are. Or perhaps if we add, I've got a photo down here, how long is this image here? What's the duration? That's where we get into the duration here. Okay, so you need to understand that number of frames represents amount of time on this timeline. You can see here there are shorter clips than this. Here's a really short one here. Okay, you can see it visually. Let me just blow this up. Hit plus on my keyboard to blow it up. Very short clip. So visually you can see that the length of this clip or the number of frames in this clip vary from shot to shot. Okay, so 30 individual frames make up 1 second. Okay, so what happens if I want a dissolve and I want it to last a half a second? How many frames or what duration would that dissolve have to be? It would have to be for half a second dissolve, I'd need 15 frames. It's just simple, very simple math. Half a second, so there's 30 frames in 1 second. In half a second, divide it in half. So I have to divide the number of frames in half, gives me 15 frames per second is a half second dissolve. If I want a 2-second dissolve, a really long overlapping transition, how many frames would that be? Well, 30 frames for 1 second, there'd be 60, twice as many frames for 2 seconds. So it's really important that you understand the relationship between number of frames and amount of time. Okay, and we're working, in our case, in 30 frames per second. If we were working in the film world, we might work in 24 frames a second. They work at a different frame rate. Video, 30 frames a second is pretty typical for most work. So there we have the resolution is 1920 by 1080 pixels, the resolution. And again, it's a raster image, so we don't really want to scale it. Frame rate is 30 frames for every second of video. Okay, the other things you can pretty much ignore here. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about time by talking about the number of frames per second, the frame rate. Okay, so let me now take you down to this clip here. This is just a photo, but I'm going to use it because it's at the start of my project. I just put a photo in. Okay, and I downloaded that from the internet. Right now, if you look up here, this little window here, this is telling us where I am in my timeline. Okay, if I click over here, look, it's moved. What do these numbers represent? Well, let me go back to the start. The first two numbers are hours. Okay, and that's for this timeline here. Is this video hours long? No. It's going to be a minute, maybe a little more. So hours, minutes, seconds, and then look, instead of a colon here at the end, it's a semicolon. It tells me that something's a little different. This is the number of frames. This is counting frames. So hours, minutes, seconds, and then frames. People tend to think milliseconds and things. It's not. It's number of frames. So if I use my right arrow key down here on this photo and I advance by 1 frame, it should count right here. It should count by frames. There you go. I've just advanced by 1 frame, 2 frames, 3 frames. So I'm just using my arrow key and I'm showing you that I'm counting frames. Now I'm not seeing anything move up here because I'm looking at a still image. Let me go back to our clip here. Okay. And what this is telling me is that on my timeline, I'm at what? I'm at 9 seconds and 4 frames in. So just over 9 seconds is where my play bar is. Okay, there's a discrepancy here between the counter there and up there. I'm not going to worry about it. But watch as I advance again using my arrow key. It's going to count. It's going to go from 9:04, 5, 6, and you're seeing motion on the screen as I advance frame by frame. And again, if you play these frames in a sequence at 30 frames per second, it creates the illusion of motion. Now here's what I want to draw your attention to. Right now we're at 9 seconds, 27 frames on our timeline. What happens when I get up to 28 frames, 9 seconds, 28 frames, 9 seconds, 29 frames? Watch what happens when I advance one more frame. Oh, it rolls over to 10 seconds and 0 frames. Go back one. Watch that. Because what happens at 29 is it stops counting up and it changes over to the next second because it's 30 frames per second. So when we hit the 30th frame, it just adds a second. And then we count up from 10. 1 frame, 2 frames, 3 frames, 4 frames, 5 frames. So that's a really important concept. Hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. You're going to be dealing with just pretty much seconds and frames. Once we talk the whole length of the project, you're going to talk probably minutes, seconds, and frames. And in fact, if you look to the right here, what does this number represent? In Shotcut, this is telling me how long my project is at the end. If I take my play bar to the end, you see, this is telling me that this whole sequence of shots is 1 minute, 40 seconds, and 15 frames. Which really translates to 1 minute, 40 and a half seconds because 15 frames is half a second. Okay. If I advance a little more, yeah, that's how long this project is. So it's really important you understand time code and that duration of something represents time. So this clip right here, the duration is how long once I've trimmed it. It's 8 seconds and 2 frames. That relationship is really important that you understand in video. Okay? We will apply it once we get to things like perhaps transitions and maybe the length of a title or something. But it's important you understand those key concepts. Number one, the resolution we're working with of our video clips is 1920 pixels by 1080 vertical pixels. Our frame rate we're working with is 30 frames per second. Every 30 frames represents 1 second in time. Okay, and that the time code is hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. So that's the technical information you're going to need going forward as we start to edit. In the next tutorial, I'll start to actually edit this project for you in Shotcut and show you what we're looking for from an editing standpoint.